Trying to do videos on a daily basis about a game is quite hard, and for the last 4 or 5 days I've managed to pull it off somehow, and we're going to try and continue that trend. But regardless to say, today's video is about the MiG-23 FOXBAT. Essentially I'm going to talk over some little bit of statistics that I have in a book, which is the Observer's Book of Aircraft by William Green. I've only got some brief statistics. It's the only book that I have that has modern jets. This book is dated, let's see, where is it? Is dated 1975, so this is the 1972 edition with 158 aircraft and 278 illustrations, but that's irrelevant to what is here. If you want to look at Wikipedia, that's fine, but for me, this is probably just as good, and I'd rather have a library of books that I can go and reference when I'm talking about these kind of things. And this is a small book, this is a pocket book, it's an observer's aircraft, and essentially they were a small series of books that did nature and whatever and blah 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 blah. No one cares. But today we're going to be talking about the MiG-23. It's a single-seat interceptor, strike and reconnaissance fighter, which kind of finds me a bit funny because on the dev server it performed worse than a MiG-21 Biz, although that could be subject to change. Again, dev servers are always that. The missiles always had issues running off the rails, particularly those new SAR missiles. Obviously, the IRST, the mode, which didn't use a tracking but instead used the infrared, was okay, but not exactly broken. And the big fuck-off missiles underneath the right-hand and left-hand side of the wings, well, they proved troublesome at most times. The R-60s had no problems, especially considering they're IR, but for some reason, the radar and the IR versions of this particular missile that are on the outside of the MiG-23 were really quite annoying. Now, it has two power plants, approximately 24,250 pounds of force, or 11,000 kilograms. It does have reheat Tomansky turbojets, and it, again, not as exactly as powerful as a MiG-21 Biz. But as you can see there, the missiles sort of launch off, they do nothing, sometimes they'll detonate, and they perform virtually identical to Sparrows in a way. As you can see here, I'm having troubles getting radar lock on this J7E. Come on, get a lock. And we absolutely get obliterated by an F5C. It takes a little while to fiddle around with these things. Sure, you're supposed to be using the radar locking missiles at higher altitudes, but at lower altitudes, you're basically utterly screwed. So it's better just to use your R60s and use the weapon selector and go through that way. Which, again, I didn't have keybind on the dev server because I was just lazy. And the status of the aircraft is believed to be flown in prototype form from 1963 to 64, with service deliveries from 1967 to 68. It's quite interesting because this book was written at the height of the Cold War, and putting military data and technology into a book that you could buy and research about was quite interesting. So the limited amount of knowledge here, what we have is a picture of the aircraft with a little CIA stamp on the side. You've then also got a 3D sort of aerial plan view of the aircraft itself. The dimensions are 41 feet, 12.5 meters length, and 70 foot, or 21.3 meters length. So there you go. Notes, the MiG-23 multi-person fighter has a number of FIA recognized records since 1965 under the designation YE-266. And on October 5th, 1967, the YE-266 established a record of 1,852.61 miles an hour, 2,981 kilometers an hour, or Mach 2.8 over a 310 mile, 500 kilometer closed circuit. Following this, with a speed of 1,841 miles an hour, 2,920, or Mach 2.7 over 621 mile, or 1,000 kilometer circuit. So, it does have a world record, or at least international standards would tell you so. But from my limited playtime and bunch of testing, this thing is great, honestly. It enables you to go pretty fast, and you've got pretty decent missiles. The fuel consumption is astounding. Like, this thing chewed through fuel. A 5-minute flight, I'd be down 10 minutes worth of fuel already, even just on reheat or afterburner. Still, the radar is probably the worst thing about this. The active radar that it gets, as you can see in the top right, and the RWR, it's not exactly ideal. It does the job, but it's not exactly great. Mind you, I suppose this aircraft lives up to its War Thunder reputation, or at least its real-life reputation of being utterly crap, because honestly, it is kind of a bit shite. And there are two user switchable modes, the default and LD, look down. Each has a high sub mode and automatically switch between 1500 and 1800 meters. There's default low, SMV, pulse, plus 4 degrees antenna elevation. And then there's default high, BSV pulse, plus 4 degrees antenna elevation. Longer range, but significantly less precise. And then there is low, or MTI, which is a coherent pulse Doppler with 0 degrees antenna elevation and 0 ground clutter, but some weaknesses are restricted to low altitude. And then there's low LD high, or BSV DH, with pulse with -4 antenna elevation. And essentially what you have here is a whole different type of radar modes, something which is a little bit confusing for the average user in War Thunder who won't probably use most of the features here. As I said, the R60s are more than capable of doing what you need them to as IR missiles, and that's probably why they've got them underneath, because honestly, missile jousting with AIM-7 Sparrows or with the new R23s is going to be a little bit of a pain. At least in my experience, is a bit of a pain. Other people have had perfect success and swear by it and have a great fun time. For me, it's a little bit clunky. You know, you've got to get your radar lock, and then you've got your missile on, and then you got to watch your 6 and do all that kind of stuff, and it just gets a little bit annoying. But because we're getting the MiG-23M next patch, along with pulse Doppler radars for the Phantom FG1, the Phantom FGR2, the T2, and the F1, the MiG-23M's radar is pretty special compared to them. Instead of being a proper pulse Doppler radar, it uses something called MTI with external coherence, as instead of being a proper pulse Doppler radar, it filters out ground clutter by comparing the Doppler shift of returns. Now, this is essentially how different types of radar work. How they work in War Thunder, however, I'm not necessarily entirely sure. And while there's a chance that many things may change on the live server, the in-real-life operation of the radar won't necessarily change. And also, disclaimer, all of this radar stuff is way more complicated, and this is as much as I can understand with my lack of proper electrical engineering and radar knowledge. Keep in mind that I trained as a mechanical engineer, and I worked with Jetstar and Qantas, two airlines here in Australia, down at Tullamarine, and out at South Australia in Adelaide, to complete my apprenticeship and work on general purpose civilian airliners. So a lot of this extra radar stuff and avionics stuff is a little bit beyond my sort of knowledge base. I can tell you about a General Electric 7.3 turbine engine if you really want me to, but honestly that is more boring than looking at radar systems and obviously looking at the functionality of a missile type, which is something completely out of my knowledge base. So in War Thunder, from the following modes, there is a list of available with these characteristics from the actual in-game file. There's SMV, which is a low pulse mode, antenna elevation scan centered at 4 degrees up. BSV, high altitude pulse mode with an antenna elevated around 4 degrees up. Longer range with longer range scales beyond 30 kilometers, but slightly less accurate. There's MV, which I have no idea what that is. BSVDH, which is a high altitude pulse mode, with, I think it's a negative down elevation centered. And this is supposed to be an additional processing over BSV to separate ground returns via how long they take to reach the radar than the target return. And yeah, this gets even more confusing as it goes on. And the way you get modules to actually be selected, or at least the radar modes in War Thunder, is a little confusing, but it makes sense if you interpret the mode switch key as being binded to the two main modules. Or modes. Default mode and look-down mode each has two sub-modes for low and high altitude, which automatically switch the radar and cannot be overridden. And yeah, that's the MiG-23's horrible radar for you in a nutshell. But big thanks to the Kerbal side for Reddit, who did some digging on the MiG-23M's radar. We had a discussion based on the things, and there is a post which explains all the radar modes in greater detail, and I still can't understand it, even though I've read it like 60 times. But suffice to say that I'll be doing some more digging on at least jet aviation technology, because it gets majorly more interesting once you start talking about stuff like beyond visual range missiles, which should probably be coming to War Thunder anytime soon. 23, I hope you enjoyed. We'll see how it plays out in the live server.